We're talking with John Lamb Lash, who has been tracing in a very interesting, very clear manner his opinion on how it is that the early Dead Sea Scrolls community had been contacted. We're a contactee cult, a UFO contactee cult, and that the Gnostic texts in Nag Hammadi show that the Gnostics looked down their nose at the belief that that an alien species was good for us, and they told us to resist that. And then we were talking about the Christianity, as John Lamb Lash sees it, is a kind of infection, a kind of corruption of the proper mystery tradition that had existed before it, that brings peace and harmony to the world, and that this corruption of Christianity, as he sees it, was brought about by a type of alien contact, bringing in alien ideas which disrupted the planet. Is that a fair description, John?
It's pretty good. Could I just make two comments?
Please do.
Christianity I describe as a salvationist religion, so I describe what I mean by salvation by a divinity that comes from off-planet. And the Gnostics viewed that not as a corruption of their mystery teachings, but as a corruption of our very intelligence, our own intelligence. It goes against the intelligence of our species, they said, for us to believe those things and rely on the promises that are made within that belief system.
And what about, you mentioned the
Melchizedek,
well,
yeah.
I think generally, Melchizedek is how I've heard it. But anyway, so that's viewed. You see that as evidence of an alien contact pre-Abraham,
right,
or at Abraham. That contact is what starts.
That's the starting point. What happened was that Abraham, who was an actual patriarch of these religions and a historical figure who lived about 1850 BC, right, 1900 BC, historians would say, actually was contacted by a humanoid entity. An alien entity that appeared in human form, calling itself Melchizedek, and that was the contact that triggered this cult that finally resulted in the Dead Sea group, who were eventually destroyed because they were destabilizing the Roman Empire, and they were a threat to the control of the empire. But the belief system of them survived and was carried over into Christianity.
And I went to go look up the Nag Hammadi texts just out of curiosity, but isn't Melchizedek mentioned in a positive way in the Nag Hammadi texts?
Well, you have really done your homework. That's a very good question. It does seem that way, but I'm not sure. The text in Nag Hammadi, which refers to Melchizedek, is very garbled. And it's really difficult to figure out what they're saying about him, it's something that I would have to leave open. I can't really give you a definite yes or no on that.
Well, see, I'm reading it right here, and this is what it seems to say. So I'm trying to sort that out. If this is an indication of that the Gnostics viewed Melchizedek as some sort of alien intruder, the first domino for this alien domination that comes through the Judeo-Christian tradition. It says here, Melchizedek, O Father of the All, because you have had pity on men, and you have sent the angel of light from your eons to reveal. And then it is a little bit garbled, and it said, when he came, he caused me to be raised up from ignorance and from the fruitification of death to life. For I have a name, I am Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High. And I know that it is I who am truly the image of the true high priest of God Most High and the world. That's very positive.
Well, it seems to be, but I have to say something here, and it may sound to some of your listeners like I'm trying to sneak out the back door here, but this is really the most honest answer I can give you. There are some things in the Nag Hammadi Gnostic materials that are not Gnostic. It's a mixed bag of very confused materials and contradictory materials. For instance, there's a fragment of a Platonic dialogue in there, the Republic. That's not Gnostic material, it's Platonic. There is a text called the first book of James, I think, which is not even a Gnostic thing. When you look at the content of it, it's actually a Jewish sermon. There is a text called the Book of Thomas the Contender, which is actually probably a Buddhist sermon, and may well have come from the cross connection that is known now to have existed between Gnostics and Buddhists. And so I want to warn the readers that it's a very, very mixed bag. And what I do, to be quite honest with you, is I take out of the Nag Hammadi material the elements that support my case for a certain Gnostic message. And so I'm guilty of being very selective. And I select what supports my case, but so does everyone else.
I would say that's the most honest thing that's ever been said on Coast to Coast Live or AM. So thank you for that. All right, then we'll come back and we'll see where the questions take us for John Lamb Lash next on Coast to Coast Live. My name's Ian Punnett. Let's get right to the calls. Hanging on for John Lamb Lash. Karen is in Wichita, Kansas, on the wild card line on Coast to Coast Live. Go ahead, Karen. You're talking with John.
Oh, hello, both of you.
Hello.
And to you.
I have a question, but I also have to tell you that I have come face to face with one of these lizards.
One of the reptilians.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Now,
where did that happen?
Well, it happened several years ago. He happened to be possessing a member of my family. And when he got in my face, he still looked to me like my uncle. And as I told him I knew who he was, he became a little angry with me, and then he dropped his human cloak.
Mm-hmm.
And
shape-shifting, as it were.
Well, shape-shifting, but I think what happens is that they project their consciousness through people who allow them to do that, and I think that's a classic case of possession.
So you think we could say maybe interdimensional shape-shifting, because they're in another dimension, but they project into someone.
They are intradimensional, and
Right.
they can be in our physical, and I have always been able to see things differently than other people, and I kind of have one foot in the other dimension anyway, and I know that I was there, and that's why I think he was so surprised to see me. And he did not reveal himself to me at first until I challenged him.
Right.
And this one had a widow's peak.
Right.
And he had hair, this widow's peak that came down in his forehead. He had a mouth that looked like the gecko on television.
Right.
It sounds a little bit like the guy who played Squiggy on Laverne and Shirley, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful. That's what it sounds like to me. Because you mentioned the widow's peak. Why is that significant?
Because I've read since, thinking I was a little bit crazy. I've tried to find out what I saw and why I had the experience, and I have read that there are two kinds. One has a widow's peak.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, there have been other people, of course, who have encountered these reptilians. And the Nag Hammadi texts do say, when they speak of that type of archon, that they are shapeshifters. They can assume various forms, animal and human.
It would impress you as being a shapeshifter. Mm-hmm. I think that they have also taken control of a lot of our judges, politicians, and so forth. Now, my question is...
Well, it certainly wouldn't surprise me to think they work through lawyers. So
well, Ian,
you'd have me there.
I am not joking.
Yeah.
This is how they're bringing down this country, and they're going to take over the whole world. It's not going to be that hard to do. Now, I have...
You had a question, though.
I do. Listening to what John has been telling us, I'm thinking that way back when they thought that they would be rescued. That sounds a whole lot like the idea of the rapture.
Yes.
Today.
Yes. Well, that is the origin of the idea of the rapture. If you trace the idea of the rapture back through history, you'll find that the most recent version of it that is embraced today by many Christians, mainstream, it comes from a Scottish girl, actually, who was a channeler and medium in the early 19th century. And she produced some channelings in which this rapture scenario was developed. But if you go deep into the historical background, I believe that you will find the prototype, let's call it, of the rapture idea in the Zadokim of the Dead Sea. And if you read the Dead Sea text, you'll see that they clearly believed that they were going to be delivered from the evils of this world by being transported or teleported by these Savior angels.
Thank you very much, Karen. Let's go to the wild card line where John is in Georgia on Coast to Coast Live for John Lamb Lash. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you very much for the show. It's interesting. I'm wondering if John has ever read the book, I'm sure he has, by Gary Renard, Disappearance of the Universe.
No, I haven't heard of that.
Familiar with it? No? Okay, it's based on Gnostic scripture, and a lot of it's based on A Course in Miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess if you haven't,
does it say anything about Sophia or the goddess Sophia?
No, it doesn't. But it has a whole different take on everything, on history, on mainstream Christianity, and it's really caused me to question a lot of things. I'm basically from a mainstream Christian background, so that's why I was curious if it. He's from Maine, also, actually.
Yeah. It sounds fascinating, but I have to say that if it doesn't, anyone who claims to be drawing on Gnostic, genuine non-Christian Gnostic texts, and does not talk about the goddess Sophia, is really missing something, because the goddess Sophia, which means wisdom in Greek, was the central figure of the whole Gnostic belief system, and their whole myth of creation is based on her. A lot of my book is about her, and so it's a little surprising to hear someone say that they're drawing on the Gnostics and not have her in the picture. But it sounds like a fascinating book, nonetheless.
It's got Dennis in Farmington, Missouri, on Coast to Coast Live for John Lamb Lash. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, Ian, thank you for taking my call. Mr. Lash, if I had your book, I would tie a rock onto it and throw it into the bottom of the sea. I think it's a bunch of hogwash. The wisdom of man, God is laughing at the wisdom of man, because the wisdom of man is foolishness to God. And if you don't have the spirit of truth living on the inside of you, then you can't discern truth.
Well,
Christianity.
I'd like you to take a different position. I'd like you to ask a question as opposed to just, if you disagree, you disagree, and that's fine, but I don't know where we're going to go other than just one more sentence of condemnation after another for the guests. So why don't you ask a question that might create, then if there's going to be, or if it's not, then we get the idea you hate this and we can just move on.
Mr. Lash comes on as an expert, but he's not an expert in Christianity. Christianity means Christ in.
Well, that's fine, and that's your belief, but I am not obliged to embrace it, and neither is anyone else. So thank you for your opinion.
We'll go to west of the Rockies, where Steve is in Pennsylvania on Coast to Coast Live for John Lamb Lash. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Ian. Hi, John. I guess I just about wrecked the truck a little bit earlier when John was talking about Paul being abducted, and that's with that cult, and that's where Christianity came from. Paul, when his name was Saul, met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and his life was forever changed, just like mine was, and millions of other people in the world.
Right.
And John, do you not believe anything that the Bible says, or is it just all a bunch of fairy tales to you? Or
I'm not
trying to be insulting or anything, but
no, it's a very valid question. I would answer it in this way. First of all, I find, as a scholar and someone who's also searching for the truth about humanity, and that a lot of what I find in the Bible, I do not consider it to be literally true, first of all, and secondly, I really doubt its value for us, and whether some of it is even sane, you know. But on the other hand, I want to say that I respect your need to have beliefs in the sacred, and if whatever is sacred in your life is sacred to you, but it's not necessarily sacred to me and other people as well.
I want to push you on the idea about sane. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, insanity, there is insanity. It is something that happens in the human species. That is to say, a derangement of the mind, a belief in ideas that are destructive. Would you say that it would be legitimate to apply the word insanity to, say, a serial killer who has some fantasy that causes him to go out and kill people? Would the word insanity apply to that kind of person?
That would imply, well, it depends. I mean, there are perfectly sane serial killers who just decide that they're more important to anybody else on the planet, and so they do it out of narcissism, but I don't know that they're insane. But let's just go with you and say yes. Then, yeah.
Well, then that's just an example. It's probably not a very good one, that human beings are capable of behavior that deviates us from our humanity. I guess deviant would be a better word. Deviant is the word that's used in the Nag Hammadi text, actually, rather than insane. So I should probably use the word deviant. Okay.
And I would suggest that it doesn't deviate us from our humanity. I fear that we can't go back at a time in history when we don't see humans acting selfishly. And
that's indeed true, and destructively.
Sorry, and I think that's, unfortunately, it's just the idea of competition and survival and dominion is within all of us.
Right.
From the very beginning. I don't think that came about as a result of Christianity. But let me get to Adam. He's got a thought on this. He's in Los Alamos on Coast to Coast Live. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm really appreciating the show.
Good. You're talking with John Lamb Lash. Go ahead.
Hi, John. Well, first of all, just my question is twofold, and I guess the first part's a statement. I just feel that, for the original person that called in and called what you were saying hogwash seemed a little rude and very intolerant, and I didn't appreciate that as well. However, at the same time, to call Christianity insane kind of seems like a punch back, and I just wish I could hear more tolerance from both sides this evening.
Sure.
My question actually has to do with the comment about Melchizedek. I am not a Christian. I tolerate what Christians believe. However, I'm not going to believe that. I'm someone that needs a little more objective proof. However, I do appreciate, John, your thoughts in this area of considering alien sources and what have you. What I found interesting was that while Christianity was labeled as a virus, I'm not going to dispute that, the evidence for Melchizedek being an alien entity was drawn from a Christian source, the Book of Hebrews. And that kind of seems ironic that you would consider Christianity to be a virus on one hand, but on the other hand use a Christian source to prove the alien identity of Melchizedek. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense. It makes sense to me because, for instance, if I were a psychologist in an institution and I was examining a patient and trying to care for someone whom, to say, had ideas that made it destructive to themselves or other people or made it difficult for them to live, then I would question that person and I would take some of what that person said as being true in order to understand their reality and to cure them or help them. So the fact that Christianity may be an expression of an alien virus in the human mind, which is what some Gnostics taught, does not mean that everything in the human mind and everything that comes out of Christianity is a lie.
Got to leave it there. We'll come back after the break. It's Coast to Coast Live. This is Ian Punnett. Well, John Lash, all the way around. John Lamb Lash, and Not in His Image is the book. We're going right away back to the phone call. So many people want to get through, and we'll talk here. Did you want to wrap up your thought that you were expressing before we went into the bottom of the hour?
No, that's fine. Let's get on with the callers.
East of the Rockies, David is in Illinois on Coast to Coast Live for John. Go ahead, David.
Thanks. Actually, I thought of another question while I was listening to you guys. My first question I'd actually asked someone that was in the faith before about this, and they just kind of brushed me off about it. But where exactly, in your views anyway, did Cain's wife come from? Because when Cain got cast out of Eden and all that, he found a wife, and she just kind of like appears out of nowhere.
Well, first of all, the story in Genesis that God created the world, a father God, a male God, created the world and placed the human species here, is you may believe that that's the literal truth, but that's just a myth or a story. I don't really believe that story. There's really nothing to explain, because I don't believe that the human race was confined to the small group of people that are described in Genesis. So, it's as I said before to the previous caller, many people believe that the Bible is a literal document describing things that happened. I personally just don't believe that, and so I can't really answer the question because I don't believe the story.
David, I'll fill in the blank for you a little bit on that, just to answer your question so we can move on to your other one, and that's this, is I think actually it'd be really easy to talk about it as a figurative story, but to say that the story of Adam and Eve is the story of God's choosing of a certain people, God imbuing certain people, and that there were other people on the earth that existed, but they existed outside of that original covenant. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Okay. Yeah. The other thing was kind of along the same lines, but like when I have I learned a long time ago, like back in high school, which is years ago, that the Bible I did not take word for word, but some things in it make sense where a lot of stuff kind of contradicts itself, and that's kind of how I believe what I believe, and if anybody doesn't like that, that's their choice. My beliefs get me through the day.
Mm-hmm.
But with the other thing was kind of like said along the same lines, when God flooded the earth, and then apparently, according to the Bible, only Noah and all his family were saved. Well, again, that doesn't make sense. If the whole earth was flooded, how did so many different kinds of people come from one small little boat? So, with your views, are you saying that like other people were saved along with Noah? Just we didn't get to hear about them?
Well, I'm saying that the story that God flooded the earth and Noah escaped alone is just a story. It's not an account of things that actually happened on the earth. The Bible, the Old Testament, has very little historical or scientific value in describing things that have happened on the earth. It's a religious document. It's not a chronicle of things that actually happened. So trying to explain the story is like trying to say, well, why did the Hollywood scriptwriters write it like that? That's just the way they wrote the story.
First-time caller line, Gary for John Lash Lamb. Go ahead. I did it the other way around again. I don't know why all of a sudden.
Have it any way you like. Lamb, Lash, Lash, Lamb.
But all night long I've been getting it right, and just all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I'm screwing it up now. Go ahead, Gary.
Good afternoon, or good evening, gentlemen. Comment and a question. Again, John, you mentioned earlier that you're, in kind of in simplistic terms, I guess, a scholar who's simply looking for the truth, as in our own hearts, I guess we all are. Looking at the three major Abrahamic religions, I guess the term is, I'm kind of curious because, again, the scholar, I guess, is a self-fulfilling term, so to speak. But I'm curious, why is it, and in Christianity, of the three major religions, in this day and age, is probably the most passive and, I guess, tolerant as far as some might call your views quite outlandish, your views. Mm-hmm. I'm curious why nobody with equal enthusiasm or vigor will, in your opinion, question the beliefs of Islam now. I rarely hear anybody who is identified as a scholar speaking out about perhaps the ludicrous statements in the Quran of all these visions coming to somebody in while they were in a cave and all the myths in there. But
you raise a very good point, and I'll answer it in two ways. First of all, I consider that Islam belongs to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that is just another version of this same salvationist virus. Of course, the Gnostics did not criticize Islam because they had been wiped out and destroyed before Islam arose. But I would also point you to the book called The End of Faith by Sam Harris. And his book is kind of a counterpart to mine because he tackles Islam. And he is opening the door for a critique. And I also want to point out something else that's very important. I am not an intolerant person at all. The fact that I criticize something does not mean that I am intolerant in the sense that I forbid it. I don't forbid Christians to believe what they believe or to embrace the Bible, but I reserve the right to challenge their beliefs and say anything I want about their beliefs and criticize their beliefs, but I do it in a non-threatening way. I'm not threatening to hurt anyone for holding those beliefs. So
there's truth to that, but I have to say, and I think the response you're getting by some people here might be some interesting feedback for you on that. That while you are saying your position is a tolerant one, just by using words like insane, that doesn't reflect tolerance. That reflects a desire to invalidate as being, as you said, having any value. And so when you say that those aren't the words of tolerance. That's a word of.
But they are the words of tolerance because I am invalidating it, but I'm not condemning it, and I'm not prohibiting anyone from having it.
Well,
intolerance would mean you prohibit it. You prohibit someone to do something. I'm not prohibiting anyone to hold any of these beliefs, but I'm exercising my right, and I'm asking for other people's tolerance to tolerate my right to invalidate them and to criticize them in the manner that I see fit. Now, I realize that people will...
there's a difference between criticism and invalidation. Once you've invalidated, what's the point of criticism? Once you say it has no value, then what's the point of a critique?
I'm saying that it's dangerous and delusional, as one would speak of a mental disease, for instance, and that's my way, as the Gnostics also spoke, of warning about the dangers of this belief system. But that doesn't mean that I push Christians around, that I tell them what to do, that I forbid them to do anything. Intolerance is something that you act out toward someone. There is no intolerance in the freedom to exchange views. That is complete tolerance.
And so you would say then, just so I understand, if Christians were to say to pagans in a community, your ideas are stupid, they're wrong, and they're pointless, you would call them tolerant Christians.
As long as they tolerated the pagans and didn't attack them and wipe them out, which is what the Christians did, by the way.
Well, I understand. But
what does tolerance mean? What are we tolerating? We're tolerating the way people live and enact their beliefs. I'm not attacking anyone.
I understand you. I just would say that that's not the essence of tolerance. If you've associated tolerance with only action, that's fine. Tolerance, I think, is much more of a state of mind. But we'll come back. We'll wrap up our callers, and we'll get everybody up for John Lash Lamb, who sees Christianity as an alien virus infecting the mind. And we'll come back to you on Coast to Coast Live. This is Ian Punnett. And we'll go to the international line. Karen is in Ontario for John Lash. Again, John Lamb Lash on Coast to Coast Live. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, Ian. Pleasure to talk to you. Been listening to your show forever.
Thank you so much. You have a question?
Yes, I do, for John. Hello. I was wondering what his take was on life after death. So many religions have their own ideas about what happens to the soul afterwards, and I was wondering what he has learned, if he's learned anything about that.
John?
Life after death teachings in the Gnostic materials that survive. There's a little bit in a non-Nag Hammadi text called the Book of Iyal, but generally you don't find, certainly the Gnostics had views on that, but there's very little surviving evidence of what they are. As far as my personal view is concerned, I don't know if that's what you're asking about, but I certainly believe that there is some kind of survival of consciousness, though probably not personal identity. after death. But I don't believe that there's any kind of punishment or any kind of judgment and punishment. And Gnostics also rejected that idea that there was a judgment and punishment that comes after death that decides whether you go to heaven or some less pleasant place.
What about the Egyptians on that? I thought the Egyptians would have maintained...
Yeah, well, they believe that life is everlasting and that we all participate in everlasting life, and we kind of just morph from one kind of life form to another. And that is more the pagan, generally the pagan view of life after death.
Wildcard line, Guy is in Omaha. Thank you, Karen, by the way. Guy is in Omaha for John on Coast to Coast Live. Go ahead, Guy.
Good evening, gentlemen. Ian, thanks for having John on. Really appreciate it. I got a comment and a question.
Sure.
I think pretty much all religions, or modern day as we understand them to be, have all been corrupted from their original intent, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
My question for John, if you would please, sir. And then I'd like Ian to let us know how we can get your book. I'd like to get your book. If John, could you give us your description as to who was or who is Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're at the last 10 minutes of this long interview today, and that is, of course, a very key question. And I take great pains in my book to answer that question and to describe who Jesus might have been, and in terms of the Jewish community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in terms of the Gnostic view of Jesus. I am reticent to give a soundbite answer here because often that would be very misleading. So I'm going to have to really cop out and say that you would really have to look into my book for me to give you a fair answer to that.
Well, let's take.
But I will say this one thing.
Wait. I would rather ignore some of the calls and just say, give us our 2 or 3 minute version. Let's get. I appreciate the idea, but I mean, I think you can do some justice to that.
I will. What I explain in my book is that in the form of Gnosticism, the version of Gnosticism that I've extracted, from the materials, the Gnostics of which I'm dealing rejected human divinity. So they would have rejected the idea that Jesus was a unique incarnation of some kind of divinity, the only begotten Son of God. But they accepted the possibility that a man called Jesus could have been a teacher, could have been a spiritual leader or teacher who was in some way illuminated or enlightened, and who in some way carried a message of compassion and a message of pointing us to our humanity. So that would be, Gnosticism presents a kind of humanistic possibility for the identity of Jesus.
But if Christianity itself, as you see it, is a kind of virus-like infection of humanity that comes from aliens, from whether it's reptilians or greys or whatever, that they infected the world through Christianity with this kind of virus, wouldn't Jesus have been the bearer of the virus?
That's a very good question. Not necessarily. Jesus is more or less the figurehead that is used by other people. For instance, an interesting thing that we have to remember about St. Paul, and it's primarily through St. Paul that Christians get their idea of who Jesus is. St. Paul never knew Jesus as a person. He supposedly had this encounter with this luminous being who announced itself to be Jesus. And so we have to realize, I think, and it's not unfair to religion to do this, but it's a necessary judgment call, that Jesus is a construct rather than an actual historical person.
You don't believe that
construct
Jesus really
has been
existed.
used.
I see. You're saying you don't believe in a historical Jesus.
I do believe that there was probably several historical Jesuses. Okay. And the question is, which is the most likely one that fits the gospel scenarios? And that, again, is something you learn from reading the Dead Sea Scrolls and reading the work of Robert Eisenman. Gives you a good portrait of Jesus as a member of the Dead Sea sect.
All right, we'll go to the wild card line where Dan is in Kansas City on Coast to Coast.
Hi, how are you, Ian?
Good. We just have a little time, so I ask you to keep the question
very
short.
Quickly to John. I noticed several callers tonight have talked about the book of Hebrews, that we think the author was Paul, St. Paul. And in that particular book, Paul mentions the royal priesthood. Now, I believe he's discussing in that, in conventional orthodoxy, he's talking about Christ. But
gotta be quick here.
What do you think that royal priesthood is? Do you?
I think that's an allusion in the language of Paul to the Zadokite material, the Dead Sea material, and it's allusion to this mysterious figure of Melchizedek, who is kind of the secret guide and leader behind the Dead Sea cult.
And finally to Bill, west of the Rockies in Palm Springs on Coast to Coast Live. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you for letting me call. There is a God. I just have one question. Do you believe in the prophecies of either the Bible or the Dead Sea Scroll or the Gnostic Gospels?
Well, there are no prophecies in the Gnostic Gospels. There are prophecies, I guess, in the Bible and prophecies connected with Christianity, but I'm not a Christian. I think that should be pretty clear by now. I'm more or less of a pagan, a modern version of a pagan, but I'm not a Christian, so I don't hold Christian beliefs. I don't forbid anyone else from holding them, but I reserve the right to express my view of what those beliefs, of what those beliefs are and what value they have.
Well, so are there any of the prophet? Are there any of the Old Testament prophets that are not influenced by this alien intervention?
No, it seems very clear to, and this is just not just my view either, but to the scholars who have specialized in what is called Jewish apocalypticism, this whole apocalyptic movement that developed from the time of Abraham through 500-600 BC and down to the Dead Sea. There's a consistent development of this apocalyptic prophetic tradition, and it's all very closely related to the phenomenon of the archons and the alien influence that the Gnostics warned us about.
Well, I would tell you from seminary, I learned this, maybe it's helpful, that there is a difference actually between the prophetic and the apocalyptic in that the prophets spoke in time of plenty.
Right.
And the apocalyptics were written in times of oppression.
I see.
When Daniel's written, it's because they feel the jackboot of oppression on their neck. And the same thing in the book of Revelation. So it actually is very different in terms of what is being spoken of. And the prophets spoke to say, hey, everything's great right now. Don't screw it up. Start doing what it is that we're called here to do. And the others were written in a very different context. But
I understand. That's a good distinction.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your patience in answering the questions and for helping us understand your point on this better. You can link up to, and I'm going to get it right, and the last time I say it or if it kills me, John Lash at his website.